In this video, we'll talk about classifying similar documents using document types. In this video, we're going to look at document types, document mappings, and index templates. We talked about index templates in the last video, so we're going to dive deep into those. All right, let's do a little review. Remember the example before where we talked about the car and the cars for sale index. Car is the type, cars for sale was the index. So we can see that we're posting our Ford Flex here. Our data set's going to have a lot of cars, so we know over time we'll be adding more cars. So let's tell Elasticsearch how to deal with them. So a mapping, as we covered in the last video, is a predefined document type. It's applied to a single index. We really just want to tell Elasticsearch ahead of time how each data attribute is meant to be treated. So if you think about a Ford 500 or Porsche 911, if we had indexed those first, the 911 and the 500 might have been treated like integers. So if we then put in a Nissan Sentra, it would break because Elasticsearch was already assuming, based on the first value, that it was going to be an integer. So when you supply something that's not an integer, well, it breaks because Elasticsearch made up its own internal mapping for that document type within that index. So here's what we need to do. We need to tell Elasticsearch which fields should be treated as full text searches, which fields have numbers, which fields are floats and longs, geolocations. So in another concept we're going to talk about here, which really applies to querying, which we'll get into later, but if you want to do a search across a document and an attribute, you could say something like cars dot name equals Ford. Or if you just wanted to search in an index, you could say, okay, I'm just going to search. I'm not going to give you an attribute. I'm not going to give you a data type. So inherently, Elasticsearch is just going to do your search against all of the attributes. So if you don't want an attribute in that all search, you can specify that. And then the last point, which we touched on, was the format of those date strings, whether it's a string-based representation of the date, or an epoch in seconds, or an epoch in milliseconds using an integer or long field. All right, so we've talked through mapping a few times. Now we need to talk about the templates in more detail that I talked about before. So here, instead of applying a mapping when an index is created, we want to be able to tell Elasticsearch something like, when Elasticsearch creates an index that matches a pattern for the name, we want to tell it ahead of time what settings and mappings to use. Settings will have things to do with how many shards and how much backup of that data is needed. And mappings, as we've talked about, are how do you treat each attribute. So in Elasticsearch, this is really used for those time-based indexes. And in this case, you can see */race or */run. So in the example in the last video, we talked about our race in Maine that was called a turkey trot. Imagine that being put into the index on 2017-11-18-race or 2018-01-02/run. So we don't have to create that index ahead of time and apply the mapping. What we can do, we can tell Elasticsearch to use a template for those indices before they're created. So here's the example mapping that we talked about before. We've got our properties and our type and our advertised distance or duration, etc. So now I'm going to show you how you apply a template. So here's a template. This template has the first top level attribute. It's an array that says, here are the index patterns in which I want you to apply this template. So in this case, they're TE* or BAR bar star, or it could be *-race or *-cars, *-car, anything you want with a star meaning any attributes or any characters of 0 or more length. So we can apply settings. Remember we talked about settings and mappings. So, and then we have the mappings, and then we'll add type or a document type of type 1 _source enabled false. We'll have some properties of that type, which in this case will have a host name, and the type will be keyword, and then we'll have a timestamp created at. So if you think about that as basically a log file entry or just some entry, it doesn't really matter. It's an example. Say this is when I create a new server on my network, I set it at the created date of now, and I set the host name value, and Elasticsearch will treat that like a keyword. So then you could correlate that with other data or something like that in the future. It's a very basic example, but you can see that we're creating a template that matches index patterns, applies some settings to that index, and then apply some mappings to different types. You can have a list of types here to apply a mapping for multiple types. I know we've talked about indices a lot. So in the next video, we're really going to look at indices. We're going to look at those settings and mappings a little bit more. I'm going to show you some examples of how date range or time-based indexes are used, and we'll talk about when to use them and when not to use them.